Usually when we talk about a medical diagnosis, there's this expectation of absolute precision. It's like engineering. You break your arm, the x-ray shows that jagged white line, and the doctor just points to the screen and says, well, there it is. There is the problem.
Right, it's binary, it's completely objective.
Exactly. Broken or not broken. It's a clean process.
And it's comforting, frankly. I mean, we as a society like things to be visible, to be categorized, and most importantly, to be easily fixed.
Yeah, for sure. But then you step into the world of, like, neurodevelopment, childhood behavior, and societal psychology, and suddenly that x-ray machine is completely useless. We're looking at a diagnostic landscape that is incredibly murky.
Oh, it really is.
And when you factor in modern cultural shifts, the politics of gender, and the, rapid evolution of our institutions, it gets infinitely more complex.
It is the absolute definition of diagnostic muddy waters, especially when we start asking whether the symptoms we are diagnosing in young men today are actually pathologies or just natural biology reacting to an environment that has, well, fundamentally changed.
And that question, whether natural masculinity is being pathologized, is exactly what we are tearing into today. Welcome to this special deep dive. We are thrilled you're joining us for this one.
We really are.
Right off the bat, if you enjoy these thorough explorations, please take a second to like and subscribe to the show. It genuinely helps us out. Today, we are reviewing an incredibly provocative, highly requested new ebook.
It's a compelling read, for sure.
And to get the full experience and really engage with the material, you should absolutely check out Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books to buy the book today. And while you're at it, make sure to follow the author at Conrad and Riker on Substack.
This specific deep dive is custom tailored for you, the listener, especially if you have a keen interest in men's rights advocacy, the manosphere, and, understanding the deep history of our modern institutions. Specifically, how those institutions operated before they evolved into what they are today.
Exactly. We are unpacking The New Masculine Renaissance by Conrad Riker. The mission of this deep dive is to explore Riker's core thesis. We are looking at how he believes historical institutions have been fundamentally captured by feminist and Marxist ideologies.
Right.
But we're not just looking at the critique. We're going to examine his actual blueprint for men to reclaim their autonomy in the modern world.
Now, since you, the listener, specifically asked for this deep dive, you already know this book is incredibly polarizing, so we want to be perfectly clear about how we are approaching this.
Yes, very important.
The source material we are covering today contains highly politically charged content touching on gender, politics, and sociology. As your guides, we are not here to play judge and jury. We are not taking sides, nor are we endorsing the viewpoints of the author, the left wing, or the right wing.
Right, we're your tour guides, not your political pundits.
Yeah.
Our goal is strictly to impartially report on the content provided in the ebook. We are here to convey Riker's original ideas, his arguments, and his data, so you can fully understand the foundation and the architecture of his worldview.
It's about mapping the territory for you.
Precisely. And to understand Riker's proposed renaissance, we first have to look at what he calls the collapse. And he doesn't start with corporate boardrooms or political elections.
No, he doesn't.
He starts this examination at the very beginning of man's life, which is childhood.
Okay, let's unpack this. Riker argues that modern childhood has become what he vividly calls an estrogen-drenched re-education camp.
Wow. That is quite the phrase.
It really is. He points out that 85% of K-12 teachers are women. And his core argument here is that this demographic reality results in environments that actively punish natural male behavior.
What's fascinating here is how he connects this demographic data to the medicalization of boyhood, right? He isn't just making a passive observation that classrooms lean feminine.
Right. He is arguing they are fundamentally hostile to male biology. He uses a deeply personal anecdote to illustrate the mechanism behind this. He talks about his own nephew, a young boy who was recently diagnosed with ADHD.
Okay.
But according to Riker's telling, the school psychologist's smoking gun for this life-altering medical diagnosis wasn't a learning deficit. It wasn't an inability to comprehend the material.
So what was it?
It was that the boy couldn't sit with his knees together like a lady during reading time.
Wait, seriously? So he's suggesting that normal, fidgety boy energy is being funneled into a psychiatric diagnostic manual.
Exactly. Riker uses this to argue that society is, in his words, chemically castrating boys simply for possessing male biology. He sees a systemic issue where the inability to sit perfectly still in a highly specific, compliant posture is treated as a pathology.
A pathology that requires powerful stimulant medication, I imagine.
Yep. If we look at the underlying logic, Riker is saying that the modern classroom rewards compliance and stillness, which are traits statistically more common in young girls, while penalizing kinetic energy and risk-taking, which are the hallmarks of young boys.
He even mentions male teachers feeling forced to neuter recess activities. He cites a Wisconsin physical education coach who was actually written up by administration for aggressive behavior simply because he let the kids play a traditional game of dodgeball.
Right, because dodgeball involves physical competition, clear winners and losers, and a degree of physical risk. To Riker, removing these elements from a boy's life is tantamount to removing the very calibration tools he needs to understand his own strength and limits.
And he scales this argument up from local anecdotes to an international level, bringing up Sweden's gender-neutral preschool.
Oh yes, the Swedish preschools.
Now, usually in mainstream media, those are held up as a progressive ideal, a utopia of equality. But Riker flips that script entirely. He claims these specific programs now correlate with Sweden ranking #1 in male teen antidepressant use.
That's a bold correlation to draw.
He draws a direct causal line between raising boys as what he calls genderless flesh robots, denying their innate biological drives, and those same boys eventually becoming miserable, highly medicated young men.
If we connect this to the bigger picture he's painting, Riker is outlining what he describes as a deliberate institutional strategy. He literally refers to this as the Marxist playbook.
The Marxist playbook, okay.
Now, for context, when Riker uses the term Marxist here, he's referring to a specific ideological tactic. He means the deliberate dismantling of traditional societal structures to create a dependency on the state. The first step of this playbook, according to his thesis, involves severing sons from their fathers.
And he brings the data to back up this claim. He cites that 43% of American kids now grow up without their biological father in the home.
Wow.
Yeah, he compares that to just 11% back in 1960. That is a staggering jump in a relatively short historical window.
It really is. And he leans heavily on historical sociology here, specifically referencing the Moynihan Report.
Right, the Moynihan Report.
For the listener, the Moynihan Report was a highly controversial government study from 1965 written by Daniel Patrick Moynihan. It warned that the breakdown of the nuclear family, specifically the absence of fathers, would lead to a catastrophic rise in poverty, crime, and social pathology.
Got it.
While Moynihan was initially talking about specific demographics, Riker applies this framework to the entire modern West. He notes that 80% of modern prisoners grew up without dads.
So step one, in his view, is removing the father figure from the home, which obviously leaves a huge vacuum.
Precisely. Step 2 is criminalizing the natural masculinity that remains. He argues that once you remove the male role model, the father who would normally channel a boy's aggression, competitiveness, and energy into productive, honorable avenues, the educational system steps in to penalize those raw traits.
Which brings to mind the story he tells about Mike Johnson, a father in Florida. This is where Riker's argument moves from passive suppression to active criminalization.
What happened with him?
Riker says this man actually spent a night in jail for reading a quote by psychologist Jordan Peterson at a public school board meeting. The quote was literally just, "Stand up straight with your shoulders back."
You're kidding.
No, it's basic posture advice, really. But Riker claims Johnson was charged with disturbing the peace through toxic masculinity.
It's a stark example of what Riker sees as the literal criminalization of traditional male guidance. The book paints a picture of a system where telling a young man to be stoic, upright, and resilient is treated as a threat to public order.
And he extends this institutional capture to the curriculum itself. He talks about math classes where 12-year-olds are supposedly taught to calculate oppression scores.
Oppression scores in math.
Yeah, the example he gives is literally deducting privilege points from a boy named Chad, if he answers a math problem correctly, in favor of a student with a different, supposedly more marginalized identity profile.
That is, wow.
But wait, let me push back on this a bit.
Yeah.
Riker draws a very hard line here. He's synthesizing a lot of disparate data points, like the 85% female teaching staff, the skyrocketing fatherlessness, the over-medication of boys with ADHD.
Right.
But he suggests this is a coordinated, deliberate Marxist playbook. How does he justify the leap from, say, changing classroom demographics and evolving pedagogical theories to an intentional, malicious demolition of boyhood?
It does seem like a leap.
I mean, are we really supposed to believe there's a shadowy cabal of third-grade teachers plotting against boys? isn't it more likely that the education system just slowly evolved to prioritize standardized testing, which naturally favors sitting still?
That's a very fair critique, and it really cuts to the crux of his argument. Riker doesn't necessarily argue that Mrs. Smith, the third grade teacher, is sitting in the teacher's lounge, rubbing her hands together in a villainous plot.
Okay, that's good to clarify.
What he argues is a concept of ideological possession. He believes that the institutions themselves operate on progressive policies that inherently purposefully create the exact monsters they claim to fear. The system acts as a machine, and the output of that machine is the suppression of male vitality.
So the people inside the system might think they're doing good, but the architecture of the system is what's hostile.
Exactly. To illustrate the consequence of this architecture, he looks at the rise of street gangs in places like Chicago's South Side. Riker argues a point that might surprise some readers.
Which is?
He says these gangs aren't just chaotic criminal enterprises. In his view, they act as surrogate HR departments for fatherless boys.
Surrogate HR departments. Okay, so essentially he's saying these gangs are acting like a perverse corporate ladder.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. If society won't give them an entry-level job or a traditional structure to build status, the local gang offers a management training program in the form of street hierarchy.
That is a perfect analogy for how he describes it. His logic is that these gangs provide the strict structure, the clear hierarchy, and most importantly, the male role models that these boys are completely starved of in their estrogen-drenched schools and fatherless homes.
It makes a twisted kind of sense.
He notes that fatherless boys are 3 times more likely to join gangs. In his view, a teenager joining a gang isn't just acting out or rebelling, he's actively auditioning for the only male role model left in his zip code.
Wow.
The gang doesn't care about his grades, his ADHD diagnosis, or his supposed depression score. It gives him a definitive purpose, a brotherhood, and a clear path to status, however destructive that path ultimately is.
So if you follow this logic to its conclusion, he's saying that by trying to neuter natural masculinity in the classroom, by punishing the dodgeball and the fidgeting society, is actually pushing these boys directly toward the most toxic, dangerous, and violent expressions of masculinity on the streets?
That is the core tragedy at the heart of his first section. He cites a Department of Justice finding that boys raised by single mothers are 300% more likely to be drugged into behavioral compliance.
300%.
He combines that with the glaring statistic that 90% of all prison inmates are male. To Riker, this is not an accident of demographics. It is a feature of a system that despises traditional manhood.
And he contrasts this sterile institutional upbringing with his own parenting. He mentions teaching his sons at home using Victorian adventure books like Treasure Island.
That's a very different approach.
He literally lets them have mock sword fights in the dirt. Why? Because he believes they need to learn honor, physical consequence, and manage aggression. Things he feels are entirely absent from modern sanitized education.
He is advocating for the reintroduction of physical stakes into a boy's development. If they don't learn how to manage their aggression through play, they will either suppress it until they break or express it destructively.
Okay, so if the K through 12 school system and early socialization are the trap for boys, we have to look at what happens when these boys inevitably grow up, because the timeline doesn't stop there.
Right, the system just shifts gears.
Exactly. Riker argues that the legal system and the institution of marriage are the traps waiting for adult men. We're transitioning from the classroom straight into the courtroom.
And this is where his critique becomes heavily focused on economics, contracts, and the legal architecture of the modern family. He views the transition into adulthood not as a liberation from the school system, but as entering a new, more financially devastating phase of institutional control.
He definitely doesn't pull any punches with his terminology here either.
Yeah.
Riker refers to modern family law as the cuckold contract and modern serfdom.
Those are heavy terms.
He argues that the state essentially financially castrates fathers. He describes modern marriage as nothing less than a government-sponsored Ponzi scheme.
A Ponzi scheme is a powerful metaphor. How exactly does he frame that?
Well, he says men invest everything up front, their time, their resources, their labor, but women hold the sole withdrawal slip. He's arguing that the early investors, the men, are essentially liquidated to pay out the later demands of the system.
This raises an incredibly important question about how the state actively mediates human relationships. Riker leans heavily on legal statistics to build this case, moving away from philosophy and into hard numbers.
Let's hear the numbers.
He cites the National Parents Organization, stating that mothers receive primary custody 90% of the time. And he points out that this overwhelming default often persists even in cases where the mother might be facing documented addiction charges or instability.
That statistic alone would make anyone pause. I mean, a 90% default rate in a theoretically impartial justice system is staggering.
It is. He couples that custody data with financial data from the U.S. Census Bureau. He highlights that 28% of child support payers are currently funding children they never legally adopted and in many cases are not biologically related to.
Wait, what? How does that actually work legally? How are men paying for kids that aren't theirs?
It comes down to the legal concept of the presumption of paternity and the best interest of the child standard.
Okay.
In many jurisdictions, if a man is married to a woman when she has a child, or if he signs a birth certificate, even under false pretenses, the state prioritizes the financial stability of the child over the biological truth of paternity.
So biology just doesn't matter to the court.
Riker paints a picture of a legal system that entirely ignores biological reality and fundamental fairness in favor of bureaucratic checkmarks. It turns fatherhood into what he calls legal serfdom. He claims modern divorced dads are routinely left with perhaps 30% of their own income after the state garnishes wages for taxes, alimony, and child support.
The examples he gives to illustrate this are truly astonishing. Take the anecdote of John from California. According to Riker, John was married for 12 years. He worked grueling 80-hour weeks, building a successful plumbing business from the ground up to provide for his family.
Sounds like a hard worker.
Right. But when the divorce hit, his ex-wife supposedly won $250,000 in alimony, her legal justification. She claimed her management of the family's Pinterest boards and holiday planning constituted emotional labor.
This is a critical point in Riker's thesis. He explores how the courts quantify value. John's actual physical labor, the busted knuckles, the 80-hour weeks, the financial provision, was dismissed by the court as a privileged career focus.
While the Pinterest boards got $250,000.
Meanwhile, the abstract concept of emotional labor was monetized at $250,000. Riker uses this to illustrate a perverse incentive structure created by what he calls the divorce industrial complex.
So he believes the system actively incentivizes women to leave marriages because they stand to gain massive financial windfalls while bearing very little of the ongoing burden of providing. It's essentially treating divorce as a highly profitable career move.
Exactly. And then there's the story from Michigan in 2022, which addresses your earlier question about paternity. A man went to court and provided absolute, undeniable DNA proof that his ex-wife's child was not biologically his.
Oh, man.
He had been deceived. Riker says the judge's response was simply, "You signed the birth certificate pay up for 18 years.
That's brutal. Just brutal.
Riker uses this specific case to show that the state will financially ruin a man for practicing basic compassion or being a victim of fraud. He argues the state is literally forcing men to subsidize another man's genetic legacy because of a signature on a piece of paper.
And Riker uses these harsh legal realities to explain broader macroeconomic trends in society. For instance, he claims that lifelong bachelors actually out-earn married men by 20%. He references economists from the University of Chicago to back this up.
And how does he explain that earning gap? I mean, the traditional wisdom is that married men earn more because they are settled and focused.
Riker flips that entirely. He attributes this 20% bachelor premium to men avoiding the catastrophic financial drain of alimony, child support, and the lifestyle inflation that he heavily associates with modern consumerist marriage.
That makes sense in his framework.
He frames bachelorhood not as a lonely existence, but as a brilliant compound interest strategy.
He has a rather vivid analogy for the marriage license, doesn't he?
He does. He says smart men treat weddings like skydiving.
Yeah.
It's incredibly thrilling, the rush of a lifetime, right up until you realize midair that there is absolutely no backup parachute if the main one fails.
Right.
You are entirely at the mercy of gravity, or in this case, the family court judge.
That's a terrifying image.
But wait, I have to stop and point out what seems like a massive contradiction here.
Okay, let's hear it.
If he is so fiercely against the legal trap of marriage, if he views it as financial suicide, how does he square this with his later chapters where he vehemently pushes for building traditional families, having children, and leaving a legacy? Isn't that totally paradoxical?
It absolutely seems like a paradox on the surface, but Riker's distinction here is crucial to understanding the manosphere philosophy. She isn't against fatherhood. He isn't against family.
So what is he against?
He is entirely against state-mediated fatherhood. He believes the current legal framework is inherently systematically hostile to men, operating under an unshakable default of maternal privilege.
So he wants the family, he just wants the government completely out of the living room.
Exactly. And to navigate this hostile landscape, he advocates for an extreme legal defensiveness. He talks about what he calls sperm sovereignty contracts and ironclad prenuptial agreements.
Term sovereignty. For the listener, what exactly does that entail?
Essentially, these are highly specific legal agreements drawn up prior to conception. They are designed to protect a man's assets, outline exact parental rights, and establish financial boundaries before a child even exists.
Wow, that is intense.
Riker argues that in today's cultural and legal climate, a man's true soulmate isn't his wife, it's his men's rights lawyer.
Wow.
He believes these specialized attorneys are the only ones who can successfully combat the biases embedded in family courts. He talks about winning jury trials by ruthlessly exposing what he calls the blatant sexism of family law.
So he wants men to approach family building, romance, and having children with the exact same legal paranoia and risk assessment of a hostile corporate merger.
Because he views the current system as an active existential threat to a man's livelihood. The data he relies on reinforces this fear. He points out that the average divorced father surrenders 50% of his total income to alimony and child support.
Have his income.
Yet, he cites U.S. Census Bureau data showing that 42% of custodial mothers admit to not spending a single dime of that child's support money directly on their kids' specific needs.
Which feeds his narrative that the money isn't about child welfare, it's about wealth transfer.
Exactly. For Riker, this isn't a family justice system. It's a massive wealth transfer mechanism. He argues it is designed to systematically subsidize a sprawling welfare state that has functionally replaced the traditional father.
He talks about how the state hands out EBT cards and housing subsidies instead of demanding personal responsibility, right?
Yes, he even brings in historical collapse theory. He compares modern America to the fall of Rome, noting that Rome finally collapsed when the plebes traded their swords and self-reliance for free bread and circuses provided by the state.
It's a compelling, albeit incredibly dark, view of modern civics. But he doesn't stop at the psychological stress of the courtroom.
No, he goes deeper.
If boyhood is psychologically penalized and adulthood is legally penalized, Riker argues this psychological stress is actually manifesting biologically. We are transitioning from the cultural and legal threats to the literal physical threats to men's bodies.
Right.
Riker argues the attack on men isn't just ideological, it is fundamentally chemical.
This is where his analysis gets truly multidisciplinary. He bridges sociology, politics, and endocrinology. He is positing that the cultural shift we've been discussing is mirroring, or perhaps causing, a physical hormonal collapse in the male population.
Here's where it gets really interesting. He points out that average testosterone levels in men have dropped 1% every single year since the Reagan era, and sperm counts. He says they have plummeted a massive 59% since 1973.
And he makes a very pointed, deliberate historical note about the year 1973, doesn't he?
He does, yes. He makes a point to note that 1973 is the exact same year the Supreme Court decided Roe v. Wade.
He uses that juxtaposition quite deliberately. He is trying to suggest a correlation, at least symbolically, between the institutional rise of feminism and the literal physical decline of male virility.
Which, quite the claim.
Now, whether one accepts that symbolic correlation or not, the biological data he cites regarding the steady decline of testosterone and sperm counts is a widely recognized phenomenon in mainstream medical literature. It's a real crisis.
Yeah.
Riker attributes this decline to a toxic combination of modern sedentary lifestyle, ideological suppression of male nature, and ubiquitous chemical exposures.
But he argues it's not just the microplastics in the water, it's the psychology of how men are treated day to day.
Yeah.
Riker argues that the very phrase toxic masculinity is a linguistic trap.
How so?
He says it's designed to punish men simply for existing in their natural state. He lays out this double standard. If you show vulnerability, society calls you weak and undesirable. If you stay stoic and strong, society calls you oppressive and toxic. You literally cannot win.
In psychology, this is known as a double bind. It's a situation where a person is confronted with two irreconcilable demands, and whichever choice they make, they fail. And Riker argues that forcing men into this double bind, specifically forcing them to suppress their natural male anger, is physically dangerous.
Dangerous to their health.
He cites Johns Hopkins medical data showing that men who chronically bottle up their anger have a 50% higher risk of suffering a fatal heart attack.
So the stress of navigating modern etiquette is literally killing them.
Yes. The physiological stress response, the constant spiking of cortisol and adrenaline without a physical release, destroys the cardiovascular system. Riker contrasts the modern office worker with Navy SEALs.
Right.
He says SEALs actually live longer, healthier lives because they treat anger and aggression not as a disease, but as a power tool. They weaponize it with extreme control.
Yeah, he mentions the 40% rule.
Exactly. They push past their perceived physical limits using what they call the 40% rule. It's the idea that when your mind tells you you're done, you're only at 40% of your capacity. They use aggression to survive, rather than suppressing their intensity just to please a corporate HR department.
To combat this chemical and psychological castration, Riker advocates for a return to ancient philosophies and biological hacks. He heavily promotes Stoicism.
Stoicism is huge in this space.
Yeah, he claims that practicing Stoicism, which involves cognitive reframing to focus only on what you can control, physically lowers cortisol levels by 23%.
It's the physiological benefit of philosophical detachment.
Right, and he pairs this with intermittent fasting. He talks about how elite MMA fighters and historical conquerors like Genghis Khan use fasting not just for weight loss, but to spike cognitive performance and aggression.
It's all about optimization.
He mentions a 2023 NIH study that found intermittent fasting spikes male cognitive performance by 14%. For the listener, the mechanism here is evolutionary. When the body is in a fasted state, it releases hormones that sharpen focus and energy to help the hunter find food. Riker is telling men to hack their evolutionary biology.
He also references Forbes data showing that high testosterone men secure 23% better deal terms in business negotiations.
Really? 23%?
Yeah. He is framing physical vitality and hormonal optimization not just as health goals, but as absolute prerequisites for societal power. If you are weak chemically, you will be weak financially.
But his claims about what is actually causing this chemical castration in the everyday world are incredibly specific, and they point straight at the fabric of modern consumerism. Let's get into the specifics because they are wild. He blames literal shopping receipts.
Yes, the thermal paper.
He says the BPA code in thermal paper you get at CVS, Walmart, and gas stations acts as a massive estrogen overload when absorbed through the skin.
Which sounds crazy at first.
He even tells a story about his friend Chad, who is supposedly 230 pounds of solid muscle. Chad blames his new habit of drinking soy lattes for making him cry while watching The Notebook. But Riker steps in and says, "No, Chad, it's not just the soy, it's the receipts you're handling all day at your contracting business."
And he extends this concept of environmental castration into digital environments. This is where the book gets highly original. He brings up the case of a Utah man named Tyler Johnson who actually attempted to sue the dating app Tinder.
Wait, a literal lawsuit over Tinder?
Yes. The premise of the lawsuit claimed that the app's core design, the rapid dopamine swipe mechanic, combined with the reality of constant algorithmically guaranteed rejections, caused chronic cortisol spikes in average men.
Oh.
And these cortisol spikes effectively chemically castrated them.
So he's suing over Tinder, causing estrogen overload.
Yes. The lawsuit was ultimately dismissed by the courts, of course. But Riker uses it as emblematic of a much broader underlying truth about how technology affects male biology. He also quotes an anonymous 4chan philosopher who posted, "Men who rage quit life never level up."
Right.
Riker is painting a dystopian picture of a society where everything from the processed food you eat to the receipts in your wallet to the dating apps on your phone is flawlessly designed to lower your testosterone, spike your stress, and render you completely docile.
Okay, I have to push back here.
Yeah.
As fascinating as this is, the methodology of his claims feels a bit, well, conspiratorial.
Sure.
He blames literal shopping receipts in Tinder for an international, multi-generational drop in testosterone.
Sure.
Is he arguing that our modern conveniences, plastics, tech, dating apps, are part of an intentional, orchestrated plot?
That's the big question.
Like, is the teenage cashier at CVS handing me my receipt actually an agent of the gynocracy? Or is it more likely that the sedentary lifestyle of modern knowledge, work sitting in ergonomic chairs for 9 hours a day under fluorescent lights, is the primary driver, rather than handling thermal paper for 3 seconds?
That is a vital distinction, and it's where Riker's argument requires careful reading. Riker doesn't necessarily claim the CVS cashier is in on a grand conspiracy.
Okay.
What's fascinating here is his view of systemic alignment. He argues that while the endocrine-disrupting chemicals might merely be the unfortunate byproduct of cheap industrialization, the result of those chemicals, a population of docile, weakened, low-testosterone men, perfectly serves the ideological goals of the establishment.
So it's a remarkably convenient coincidence for his ideological opponents.
Exactly. The system doesn't need to conspire if the environment naturally pacifies the threat. He makes grand historical comparisons to drive this home.
Like the fall of Rome.
Yes, he compares our modern situation to the fall of the Roman Empire, noting the theory that lead pipes drove the Roman elites insane, collapsing the empire from within. But modern men, he argues, aren't being poisoned by lead. They are actively outsourcing their own extinction to microplastics, BPA, and highly processed diets.
He points out that 80% of male millennials show clinically low testosterone symptoms, while simultaneously 100% of them own video game consoles.
And to Riker, that correlation is everything. A population of men hooked on digital dopamine, suffering from artificially low testosterone, is a population that lacks the physical and mental aggression required to revolt against an oppressive system.
He keeps them quiet.
Right. He points to a Rutgers sociology study claiming that men with low testosterone are actually 5 times more likely to vote for socialist political policies. He argues that physical weakness translates directly into political submission. You rely on the state because you cannot rely on yourself.
Which seamlessly transitions us to his next major point. If the modern world is chemically toxic and legally hostile, what do men do? They don't fight. They retreat. Riker notes that many men retreat to screens.
They absolutely do.
This brings us to his scathing critique of digital escapism and his proposed physical solution, which he calls the trad wave.
This is a pivotal moment in the book. This is where he moves from diagnosing the disease to prescribing the cure. He focuses intensely on how men spend their time, their money, and their vital energy when they decide to opt out of the mainstream system.
Riker goes incredibly hard against what he calls the digital opium economy. He's talking about TikTok, internet pornography, and hardcore gaming.
Digital opium is a great way to describe it.
Yeah, he has this derogatory term for men who spend 14 hours a day gaming. He calls them couch princes. He also refers to them as digital eunuchs. He paints this incredibly depressing picture of men slumping in front of Diablo 4, sipping liquid meal replacements like Soylent, completely detached from physical reality. He says they have traded actual historical sword hilts for calloused thumbs from mashing joysticks.
If we connect this to the bigger picture of evolutionary psychology, Riker points to the hypergamy of the digital age.
Hypergamy.
Right. Now, for the listener, hypergamy is an evolutionary biology term. It describes a mating strategy where individuals, traditionally females in many mammalian species, seek partners of higher socioeconomic status, competence, or physical dominance.
Makes sense biologically.
Riker argues that the internet, and specifically social media, has hypercharged this instinct, creating a globalized winner-take-all mating market.
Right, because historically you only competed with the guys in your village. Now you're competing with a millionaire on a yacht on Instagram.
Exactly. And this creates a system where average or beta males, realizing they cannot compete in the top tier, resort to paying for parasocial artificial relationships through apps like OnlyFans.
He describes these men as digital sharecroppers, toiling away on algorithmic plantations.
That's a vivid metaphor.
He cites the statistic that 83% of OnlyFans creators are women, with the top 1% of those creators making vastly more money than highly educated male engineers.
And the example he uses to hammer this home is wild.
Oh, the LA barista.
Yes. He talks about an LA barista who lives in her mom's basement, but who makes $200,000 a year from 137 online boyfriends. And these men literally pay subscription fees just to watch her eat cereal in lingerie on a webcam.
It's hard to believe, but it happens.
He also mentions a guy named Mike who spends 4 hours a day acting as a volunteer moderator, defending a Twitch streamer named Princess Glitter Gamer from internet trolls. And Riker points out with utter disdain that Mike has never actually touched a woman in real life.
Riker elevates this critique by comparing it to collapsed ancient societies, doesn't he?
He does. He talks about anthropologists who have identified patterns of beta provisioning in fallen civilizations. These are societies where men traded their hard-earned resources for entirely false mating opportunities.
Fascinating.
He compares these modern OnlyFans subscribers to Incan peasants who spent their lives weaving intricate textiles for high priestesses they would never ever be allowed to touch. Or Bronze Age men in Crete sending their grain harvests to temple prostitutes as a form of worship.
He's saying modern men are worshiping at a digital temple, sacrificing their resources for pixels.
Right.
So what is his solution? It's simple but radical, entirely log off.
Right.
He proposes building physical parallel institutions. He calls this movement the trad wave. He wants men to form exclusive physical brotherhoods based entirely on shared risk, extreme competence, and brutal manual labor.
He argues that shared physical risk builds male trust 4 times faster than any corporate HR trust fall ever could. He backs this up by citing a 2023 study from the Journal of Evolutionary Biology.
What does the study say?
The neurochemistry here is fascinating. Surviving a risky or physically demanding situation together releases a potent cocktail of oxytocin and testosterone in men, forming unbreakable bonds.
Like brothers in arms.
He notes that extreme wilderness survival retreats for men are up 600% since 2016, with activities like axe throwing and rucking replacing the emotional vulnerability sharing circles of the 1990s.
He gives some really vivid, colorful examples of this trad wave in action. There's a guy he calls Cyber Heirs, who used to be a massive Reddit moderator.
Shares, yeah.
Riker says this guy used to mainline Mountain Dew in moderate forums for free, but he had an awakening, quit the internet entirely, left a final post titled "Sparta was right," and moved to the Midwest. Now he literally forges Damascus steel katanas for divorced dads.
It's the ultimate rejection of the digital for the physical. And it's not just secular. Riker talks about a Catholic priest down in Waco, Texas.
Yeah.
According to the book, this priest noticed his male congregation was dwindling. So he swapped out the traditional, quiet Bible study groups for Brazilian jiu-jitsu mats in the church basement. And as a result, male attendance tripled.
Because they were finally engaging physically.
Yes. The priest noted that men inherently crave discipline, combat, and hierarchy, not coffee and donuts.
Makes sense.
Riker uses this to launch a critique of modern Christianity, accusing it of having a feminine rot. He suggests that men are fleeing churches because they are being offered a neutered, passive version of spirituality that completely ignores the warrior ethos found in the Old Testament.
And then he talks about the Alaska Iron Dog snowmobile racers. These are guys who bond over surviving negative 40-degree temperatures and literally outrunning moose in the frozen tundra.
That sounds intense.
Riker points out they don't sit in therapy sharing circles to discuss their childhood trauma. They talk through nails, engine grease, and sweat equity. They process their reality through action, not navel-gazing.
So what does this all mean? Riker is essentially arguing that the digital world, by its very design, rewards submissive, addictive behavior and pacifies male energy. The physical world, conversely, demands competence, resilience, and strength just to survive.
Right.
He points out a fascinating data point. Reddit's men's rights communities grew by 500% immediately after OnlyFans temporarily announced a ban on sexually explicit content and chargebacks.
Really? 500%.
Yes. To Riker, this shows how quickly men will wake up and organize politically when the digital illusion of intimacy breaks.
But let me ask you, how realistic is this tradwave solution? He's telling guys who work in IT or accounting to literally start pressure washing businesses, forge swords in their garages, and build replicas of ancient fortresses.
Yeah, the fortress thing is a bit much.
I mean, he talks about a group in Texas that actually built a full-scale replica of Helm's Deep from Lord of the Rings on a ranch. Is he seriously expecting a mass exodus of men from the corporate and digital world to go play blacksmith in the woods?
It sounds like L.R. Aaron, live-action role-playing when you focus just on the swords. But Riker's tradwave is broader. It's about creating what he calls masculinity guilds. It's about establishing intentional spaces where achievement and competence matter infinitely more than feelings or diversity quotas.
So it could be a trades business, not just a medieval forge.
Exactly. He mentions a buddy named Jake. Jake skipped the traditional college route entirely, opened a specialized pressure washing franchise at age 19, and now vastly out-earns his aunt, who is a tenured gender studies professor.
Wow.
Riker wants men to cut out the HR departments entirely and replace them with absolute meritocracy and tangible real-world skills.
He even mentions a controversial tech CEO who literally fired his entire HR department in 2019.
Oh yeah, that story.
This CEO hired only men based strictly on coding ability, and he saw his company's productivity triple, while harassment claims obviously dropped to zero. Riker notes that the mainstream media called the CEO a misogynist, but his actual employees praised the environment for being efficient and drama-free.
Exactly. Riker is advocating for parallel economies, spaces where men don't have to self-censor, walk on eggshells, or apologize for their competitive nature.
Yeah.
He points out that religious congregations with exclusive all-male Bible studies grow 4 times faster than inclusive mixed-gender ones. He also cites data showing that men with strong localized male friendships have a 50% lower suicide rate. To Riker, these guilds aren't just fun hobbies, they are critical survival mechanisms in a hostile culture.
Okay, but if men actually start waking up and trying to build these parallel institutions, Riker warns that the establishment isn't just going to let them quietly walk away.
No, of course not.
They rely on male tax dollars and male labor. He says the institutions will actively try to censor, bankrupt, and destroy these movements. This brings us to his final, deeply paranoid chapters on ideological warfare and legacy.
This is where his analysis tackles the control of information. He looks at how institutional powers silence dissent and memory hole inconvenient truth.
Riker claims that academia and big tech are actively colluding to erase masculine knowledge. He points to the replication crisis in gender studies.
Which is a real phenomenon in academia.
For the listener, the replication crisis is a massive ongoing issue in the soft sciences where researchers literally cannot reproduce the results of landmark studies, suggesting the original data was flawed or biased. Riker claims 90% of gender studies papers collapse under this basic scientific scrutiny.
And he cites a highly specific and very real academic paper to highlight the absurdity.
Yes, I couldn't believe this was real. I had to look it up, but it is. He cites a paper called Feminized Glaciology, published by researchers at the University of Washington. Apparently, it argues that glaciers and ice sheets are victims of masculine-dominated imperialist science.
Feminist glaciology.
Yeah, he uses that paper, which many view as akin to the famous Sokol hoax, where nonsense jargon was published just to prove the lack of academic rigor, to argue that the entire field of gender studies operates without scientific merit.
Yet, he notes, it receives massive institutional funding, with some university gender studies departments receiving 300% more funding than critical STEM programs.
That is a wild funding disparity.
But he argues the censorship goes far beyond just wasting money on bad curriculum. He looks at Title IX offices on college campuses, describing them as literal ideological gulags.
Ideological gulags where due process goes to die. He claims these offices use a standard called the preponderance of evidence, which means just 51% likelihood, to completely ruin men's lives without ever allowing for basic legal rights like cross-examination.
Right.
He cites a terrifying case at the University of Michigan, where a male student was expelled merely because a professor claimed his presence made women unsafe, after the student quoted the dissident feminist Camille Paglia in class.
That's insane.
There was no actual trial, no evidence of harassment, just an accusation of bad vibes. He also points out that Harvard's secret Title IX tribunals offer accused men fewer basic rights than a Starbucks barista accused of burning a latte.
Riker argues that these institutions are enforcing a strict religious orthodoxy. He notes that a Berkeley sophomore got expelled in 2022 just for printing out Jordan Peterson's famous clean your room advice and pinning it on a dorm bulletin board.
Expelled for that.
The charge was promoting dangerous patriarchal hierarchy. And when men recognize this hostility and try to seek out alternative information online, Riker says big tech immediately steps in to suppress it.
He brings up an author named Mark Baxter in his book, No More Mr. Nice Guy. Now, this isn't some radical manifesto. Riker claims this book just teaches men how to set healthy emotional boundaries.
Right, it's pretty standard self-help.
But Riker claims it was aggressively shadow banned by Silicon Valley algorithms. He says it ended up selling more copies underground on eBay than hooked on phonics, precisely because it was hidden on mainstream platforms. He contrasts this by pointing out that a book like Mein Kampf remains easily available with 2-day prime shipping in the history section.
He also mentions a scandal involving the New York Public Library, supposedly purging 50 problematic men's studies titles from its shelves in the name of safety.
I remember hearing about that.
Riker notes that this attempted purge backfired spectacularly, leading to 40,000 downloads of those exact books on encrypted Telegram channels within 72 hours.
It's the ultimate Streisand effect in action. The harder you try to hide it, the more they want to read it.
Exactly. He says digital samizdat, which is the old Soviet term for underground, self-published dissident literature, thrives wherever physical shelves are heavily policed.
And this leads to my absolute favorite example of underground resistance in the entire book.
Yeah.
He talks about rogue engineers inside major tech companies who were printing out essays by Mencius Moldbug.
Ah, Moldbug, yes.
Now, Moldbug is the pen name for Curtis Yarvin, a highly controversial neo-reactionary thinker who writes dense essays about how modern democratic institutions are just a cathedral of progressive ideology that needs to be bypassed.
Very dense stuff.
These engineers are taking these heavy political essays and formatting them to look exactly like IKEA bookcase instructions.
Just to sneak them past the corporate HR diversity monitors scanning the network.
Exactly. That is incredibly creative. Just imagining an HR rep walking by, thinking someone is struggling with Scandinavian furniture instructions, when really they're reading a manifesto about how testosterone links to building civilizations.
It perfectly highlights Riker's core belief about information in the 21st century. He says ownership is power. He argues that you cannot memory hole what is printed on physical paper and stored offline in a place where Wi-Fi cannot reach.
Right. Digital is easily erased.
Digital content is ephemeral. Physical books are a fortress. He points to Nielsen BookScan data reporting that hardback book sales to men under the age of 30 jumped 212% recently.
Which explains his own lifestyle. He talks about converting his own garden shed into an ideological armory. He tells his wife it just stores the lawnmowers, but inside, he's got Marcus Aurelius' Meditations, stacked between literal steel plating with a first edition of the controversial book Might is Right serving as the doorstop.
That's dedication.
I have to ask, is this just doomsday, prepping for literature? Or is there a genuine, justified fear that digital censorship will erase this specific brand of men's rights philosophy entirely from the historical record?
Based on the trends he cites, Riker genuinely, deeply fears digital erasure. He points out that Amazon can delete titles from your Kindle remotely, Google algorithms can hide search results on page 50, and digital payment processors can completely deplatform dissident voices overnight, cutting off their ability to feed their families.
That's a lot of centralized control.
He notes that in 2021, 60% of Amazon's quietly banned titles were written by men critiquing modern feminism. Physical books, he argues, form a lasting, uncancelable legacy that cannot be algorithmically manipulated by what he calls tech oligarchs gaslighting you about community guidelines.
And this leads into the conclusion of the book, what he calls his anti-feminist playbook.
Yeah.
It involves actively, aggressively fighting back.
Yes.
So what does this physical playbook actually entail for the average guy listening to this?
It involves utilizing the system's rules against itself.
Yeah.
He talks about crowdfunding massive legal defense funds for frat boys accused by campus kangaroo courts.
Okay, fighting fire with fire.
He gives a triumphant example of a group of Duke fraternity brothers who were sued for supposed microaggressions over hosting a steak eating contest. Riker says they crowdfunded a lawyer, countersued the university for defamation, and won a massive settlement. The playbook also involves localized economic warfare, like boycotting gyms that focus more on enforcing pronoun usage than buying heavier pull-up bars. But perhaps most importantly, the core of the playbook is actively mentoring the next generation in the physical world.
Right. He suggests taking any boy under the age of 18, a nephew, a neighbor, a son, and forcing him to physically fix 5 broken objects: a leaky faucet, a dying lawnmower, a blown car fuse.
It's about teaching competence.
And he says you pay them in physical silver coins for their labor while dropping truth bombs about the realities of family law and human nature. He believes this combination of physical competence and unvarnished truth inoculates them against becoming what he calls soy-marinated NPCs.
It all comes back to his overarching theme of legacy. Riker believes that a man's legacy isn't built in HR seminars or poetry slams. It is the calloused hand that reaches down and yanks the next generation upward by their bootstraps. He quotes Oxford sociological data showing that the presence of just 3 positive, competent male role models in a community can negate 72% of the psychological damage caused by fatherlessness.
Wow. Okay, we have covered a massive amount of ground today. Let's bring all these disparate threads together. Riker's book, The New Masculine Renaissance, clearly isn't just a critique of modern culture. It is a full-throated call for a total civilizational paradigm shift.
It absolutely is.
He is arguing for a hard pivot away from what he sees as a feminized, Marxist-captured digital society and a move towards stoic, highly physical, male-led parallel institutions.
He has systematically attacked modern education, the family court system, the digital dopamine economy, and academic censorship. He presents them not as isolated issues, but as highly interconnected facets of a quiet, relentless war on male biology and autonomy.
Yeah.
He demands that men stop apologizing for their nature, start building physical legacies, and form unbreakable bonds with men who would literally bleed for them, completely rejecting the digital dopamine traps that keep them docile and politically submissive.
It is a heavy, intense, and highly provocative thesis. And as we wrap up, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final thought built entirely on the source material we just unpacked.
Oh, for it.
If Riker is right, if it's true that our modern digital dopamine addictions, the endless swiping, the hardcore gaming, the streaming, are actually a highly effective form of civilizational pacification, then perhaps the ultimate act of modern rebellion isn't holding a sign at a political protest at all.
Perhaps the ultimate, most dangerous rebellion is simply logging off, walking outside into the physical world, and building something tangible with your own two hands.
Something to seriously mull over the next time you pick up your phone. If this deep dive sparked your interest, challenged your perspective, or gave you a new lens to view the culture war, please make sure you like and subscribe to the show.
Please do.
Go check out Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books right now to buy Conrad Riker's ebook, The New Masculine Renaissance, and dive into the full unfiltered manifesto for yourself.
You won't regret reading it.
Finally, be sure to follow the author at Conrad N. Riker on Substack for his ongoing essays. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you on the next Deep Dive.